Welcome, everybody, to the Indiaspora podcast. My name is Sanjeev Joshipura, and I'm the Executive Director of Indiaspora, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Indiaspora is a nonprofit organization founded in 2012 by a noted venture capitalist and investor and entrepreneur named M.R. Rangaswamy. And our focus is to position and inspire the global Indian diaspora as a force for good, with a focus on philanthropy, entrepreneurship, and political and civic engagement. We do our activities worldwide in numerous countries which have strong Indian diaspora. And we also work across an age range which encompasses younger people as well as people who are more accomplished in the later stages of their careers. We are starting a series of podcasts and videocasts, and today is the first one. It is also the most opportune first episode because it is with none other than Parag Khanna. Now, Dr. Khanna, who is based out of Singapore, is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler, and best-selling author. He is the founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. What we're going to talk about today is Parag's newest book called Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, which has just been released. In fact, he's on a global tour as we speak around the world, including Europe, Asia, America, and so forth, to talk about what he's written about. One notable fact about Parag is that he has traveled to more than 150 countries, and he's a young global leader at the World Economic Forum. Parag, welcome to the program.
So great to see you, Sanjeev. Thanks so much for having me on.
Delighted to have you, and so glad to continue our conversations with you, which I know we have started in the past on one of your previous books regarding Asia. But today we want to talk about all of the interesting ideas contained in Move, and there's so many of them to unpack here. So let me just start by sort of setting the stage a little bit here for our listeners and viewers. You know, obviously, I know your book is about the future of mobility, but there's an old saying that to understand the future, you've got to first understand the past. And so tell us what your research has told us about why and how human civilizations have been on the move for the past so many millennia.
Well, it's a great place to start with the past, and it's a reminder that we humans, even though we don't think so, have been a nomadic species for most of the last 100,000 years since our proto-human ancestors began wandering out of Africa and colonizing the continents. We have been nomadic. And only in the last, say, 5 to 7,000 years did we settle into more sedentary or pastoral communities, towns, villages, cities that we know today. And only in the last few hundred years have we been an industrial civilization. So there is this constant evolution in how we live and where we live. And we have to remember that where we live is shaped by the geopolitics of borders, by, of course, climate and and climate change, and many other variables. So we cannot take for granted that where we are now is where we'll be in the future. So that's very well historically grounded. And that is the future that I want to explore. And it's not just migration, it's human geography. And in a way, this is a sequel to some of my earlier work where I've looked at the political geography of borders, the functional geography of infrastructure. And now this is about human geography. The bottom line is, Sanjeev, there are 8 billion human beings. And I set out to answer the question, where will the 8 billion of us be in the year 2030, 2040, and 2050? And I came up with some surprising answers.
Weighty questions and a lot to unpack there. And we'll get to some of those things. In fact, you talked about geopolitics, you talked about climate, you've talked about where people will live in the future, and we'll touch upon all of those as part of this program. But let me just dwell, if I could, for a second. We've discussed the past. Let me dwell on the present, because right now is a historic time in the world. We are going through this pandemic, and there's a lot of people that have suffered untold misery, and the world is changing before our eyes in ways that perhaps some of us understand maybe a little better than others, and some of us think we understand but don't quite really, and the future will tell. But there's a couple of things I want to ask you about as pertains to the present. One is, what is your perspective on how COVID-19 is shaping human movement. And allied to that, so that's a factor that's obviously sort of in some ways, I guess, beyond sort of immediate proximate human causes and how we can affect the world. But the one thing that we can and do affect the world in a very immediate way is the policies, our immigration policies, immigration laws. You talked about borders, politics, geopolitics, all of that. So how are the twin forces of immigration policy and the pandemic impacting human movement today?
It's a great question. And, it is a very ironic moment in some ways, because if you remember, the data from 2019 told us that we had reached a record number of people crossing borders in 2019, 1.5 billion people, and more than 300 or about 300 million people living outside of their country of origin, such as members of the Indian diaspora. But then it all stopped. And we actually had a reversal. And a reversal doesn't mean that no one moved, because to move is to go somewhere, even if it's back to where you came from. And the largest movement of people in the year 2020, Sanjeev, was Indian guest workers from the Gulf countries going back home to India. Several million people went back to India during that time. And to this day, right now, there are people from New Zealand who are waiting in a queue to return home to New Zealand because they're waiting for quarantine hotels to empty out so that they can return home, and they're probably going to resettle in New Zealand. So people have been moving, but at nothing like the number and not in the same direction as before the pandemic. Then, of course, immigration controls is a question. Now, it depends on the country. In the US, of course, we had tightening immigration under the Trump administration, but we clearly see a genuine effort by the Biden administration to expand the H-1B quota and many other measures. Canada has remained very consistent in expanding its immigration policy. It set a target of 400,000 new immigrants every single year. And you can see that the Asian populations in Europe have been growing. I write a lot in the book about what I call Asian Europeans. Now, that's not a phrase that's ever been used before. We're familiar with Asian Americans like you and me, but who are the Asian Europeans? It turns out there's less than 4 million Asian Europeans, whereas there's 25 million Asian Americans. But of course, Asia is much closer to Europe than it is to America. And Europe's labor shortages are even more severe than North America's. And of course, all of this trade and infrastructure is being built across Eurasia, the new Silk Roads. Isn't it worth exploring whether or not you will have way more South Asians and East Asians in Europe in the future than we have today? And that's one of the vectors geographically that I explore. So in the future, even though we've had these lockdowns now, we're also learning how severe our labor shortages are. If you look at the UK with the truck driver shortage and the nursing shortage, countries are realizing that they shouldn't mess around with and politicize their immigration policy. The final point I'll make is that we're going to digitize this more. We have spent 1 century bureaucratizing migration with passports and visas and stamps and consulates and letters and affidavits and deposits and all of that stuff. But now, to go anywhere, you have to have a digital, QR code for your vaccine passport, immunity certificate. You can apply that to other aspects of travel as well, and we can start to make the future mobility much more efficient than the past mobility. So the changes that people think of the pandemic imposing on travel are not all negative. We could actually learn the lessons and make it more efficient for the future.
I think you've made a lot of fascinating points there, Parag. One point that I just want to sort of repeat for emphasis is something that I know is contained in the book in a graphical sort of pictorial format as well, where you talk about the reverse migration, I guess, of Indians in the Gulf countries moving back to India and in large numbers. And this was a statistic that really was interesting to me personally as I was looking at some of the facts and figures in your book. Let's now go towards the future, because that is, after all, what the book is about. At its core, the future of human mobility. You've talked about forces that can usher in a new age of mass migrations, right? And one of the things that you've talked about very prominently in this book is indeed climate and climate change and the impact thereof on migration. I guess, we read articles in the newspapers every day about especially coastal cities. I mean, climate change writ overall at large, but then specifically about coastal cities, such as Miami or Mumbai or Jakarta, and what rising sea levels means for those cities. So tell us a little bit, if you will, about how you think climate change is going to impact human migration.
It's going to be the biggest driver. And let's remember, for most of the past 100,000 years, climate was the main factor in our human geography. After all, as just hunter-gatherer nomads, we settled in latitudes that were, temperate. So most of the human population lives between 20 and 30 degrees north latitude. That's not some kind of accident. It's not like there's a fence at 30 degrees north latitude. It's because that's where farming became possible at large scale. And that's still where we are. But as you know, the climate models are telling us that what's called the climate niche, this optimal latitude of those 10 degrees of latitude that within which most humans live, is shifting northward. And as it does, every 1 degree of temperature rise corresponds to about 1 billion people who fall outside of that optimal temperature niche. And that means that, given how behind the curve we are in addressing climate change, we can fully expect that climate change will be a big driver of mass migrations in the future. Now, let's remember, it already is, because the number of climate refugees in the world, according to the United Nations, is larger than the number of political refugees. So we already live in a climate migration world. Now, of course, we have to apply this to India and to South Asia, because the falling water tables, the rising sea levels, the droughts, and other factors are making parts of India, unlivable. And people are moving within the country, they're recirculating to new places, and of course, they're migrating internationally. So one of the things I do in the book is to look at, what are the climate oases, which is to say the places that are winners from climate change, places where you could imagine much larger populations settling, and who will go there. So I actually found, and this is, of course, from my own travels. When I go to Kazakhstan, when I go to Russia, when I go to Northern Europe, I see more and more and more Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis all over these geographies, because they may be going one by one family at a time, whatever the case may be, but it really adds up and is noticeable. And again, it overlaps with these other factors like labor shortages and so forth. So there are a lot of countries, whether it's Canada or Kazakhstan or Russia, that are realizing that they need people. They need young people. They need people with the right skill sets. And in fact, South Asians have those skill sets. And so they're actually actively importing them.
You've spoken about a very serious topic, obviously, which is the impact of climate on human mobility and geography. But it's a funny sort of episode that comes to my mind that kind of reinforces the point that you made about, you see Indian diaspora in unexpected places, or at least places that were hitherto unexpected. Now they might be getting somewhat more frequent. There's a bunch of Indian cricketers, I believe, that went to, because in India, as cricketers are mobbed on the streets, right? And you can't walk out on the streets at all. And so a bunch of them, I think, decided to go on vacation to some more remote sort of European destination that you typically don't expect Indians at. And they were in line at a coffee shop, waiting for a coffee. And lo and behold, 3 Indians come up from behind them and say, "Hey, I want your autograph," And so that kind of just underscores what you're talking about.
We are everywhere. We are absolutely everywhere. And again, one of the conclusions, or one of the claims that I make in the book, is that whereas today the Chinese diaspora is much larger than the Indian diaspora, there's no question, zero doubt, that the Indian diaspora in the future will be much, much larger than the Chinese diaspora. And, outward climate migration is one reason why. There are many, many others.
I think that's a great point, Parag. I do want to talk about that. I want to talk, in fact, quite specifically about the Indian diaspora and the sort of India's comparative advantages as you've laid them out vis-a-vis China in your book. Let's just get to the Indian diaspora first. I mean, after all, I do represent Indiaspora, and you and I represent the Indian diaspora. So it's an absolutely apposite topic to be talking about. India has a lot of young people, as you know, who could sort of really dictate the future, India's destiny moving forward. We've often heard the phrase demographics is destiny. And there is merit to that, I do think, although it's somewhat oversimplified, but, broadly speaking, it does make sense. So what can you tell us about how this generation of younger folks from India is likely to move around the world, and how will that differ from generations past?
Right. Well, I gave one example earlier about the number of Indians that I've witnessed and met in Germany, and it's interesting because I went to high school partially in Germany, and when I was there in the 1990s, I was certainly the only Indian for hundreds of kilometers radius. But in this book, I tell the story about going to the headquarters of SAP, the German software company outside of Frankfurt. And to my surprise, I encountered many, many, many Indians. I couldn't believe it. It reminded me of Cisco systems, in California. And it occurred to me that, what would Europe's largest software company be if they hadn't recruited all of these thousands of Indians to go there and to actually live there? Not remote workers in Bangalore, but rather to actually go and live in Germany. And it's massively expanded the capacity of this all-important European company. So that's just one example. Then I also talk about Indian farmers in Russia. And of course, there's actually a historical, almost, Cold War fraternity between Indians and Russians. There's a saying that Russians are the Punjabis of the North, right? And you feel that way when you're out in the far east of Russia. So, at this point, also there's 50,000 Indians living in Japan. It's another example, which is a very large number. So, youth is one comparative advantage, right? The median age in India is much younger than the median age of China. The second is geopolitics, because of course China is comes under heavy suspicion today, whereas Indians don't. India is considered very friendly in the West geopolitically, and that's very much what's happening right now. Then there's skills and language. Indians have studied IT or nursing, medicine, and have been trained in English, whereas Chinese, of course, haven't. So all of these factors taken together are what are driving this shift in momentum between the two diasporas. And I see no reason why those trends wouldn't continue.
Schooling in Germany, Parag. Sprechen Sie ein bisschen Deutsch?
Mehr als ein bisschen.
Ich habe vergessen mein. I lived in Germany myself for a couple of years and schooled there as a child many decades ago.
Oh, so. Wow. How about that?
But anyway, so talking about China and India, in your book, you've talked about how China's population will very shortly, in the near future, start a sort of on a declining curve, if you will, and how India's will still remain increasing for some time. And you've extrapolated that a little bit to talk about how you think in the longer term future, India has a relative advantage compared to China. I know I'm oversimplifying, but this is sort of the nutshell version of it. Now, if I could, let me just sort of poke and prod a little bit here. Yes, granted, China's population will start declining before India's, but at some point, after that, India's will too. That's one. And two is that China at this point in time, looking at, per capita GDP, looking at various stages of economic development of those two countries, is far ahead of India. And so how do you foresee that India in the longer term will have the comparative advantage?
Right. So in a way, when I'm talking about the diaspora, I'm talking about Indians, not necessarily India, and this is a critical difference, right? Indians have that capacity to assimilate and adapt and have the skills that are needed elsewhere. And again, are considered friendly and have, the chain migration and the networks, and all of that plays to the advantage of Indians. For India, the climate models are actually very clear that it's a very difficult road ahead, given climate change and rising sea levels and droughts and so forth. So India has to make significant investments in its capacity, especially things like irrigation, of course, clean water, drinking water, desalination. These kinds of things are absolutely crucial. Of course, decarbonization of the economy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce air pollution, use more renewable energy, which is better for the economy in addition to being better for the environment. So the agenda for India itself is very, very clear. And Indians all over the world, of course, can and should be a part of it, that transformation that's necessary across infrastructure, industry, and so forth. And, the Indian diaspora has been such a strong contributor. So, there it's a two-way street. From a climate standpoint, China also has stress, but it also has enormous muscle, enormous resources, enormous capability. This is one area where, there's no question that India can learn a lot from China and from other countries. But one of the important, things that's underway is that the global eye, commercially, scientifically, is turning towards India. You can see a lot more interest in deploying technologies in India to make the economy, to make industry more renewable, make power generation more sustainable, to enhance agricultural output despite climate stress. Of course, the IT sector is really being looked at very closely. The fact that there is so much tension with China has meant that with the Quad arrangement, the US, India, Japan, and Australia, as well as other mechanisms such as the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative. All of these efforts are trying to enhance India's capacity to be less dependent on imports from China, trade with China, and to even become a strong competitor of China's in the commercial domain and high-tech areas. So all of this is evolving very quickly. There's obviously a lot of both confidence and hope that India can deliver on the expectations.
Fascinating, and an important distinction, Parag, there between Indians and India, which is important to bear in mind. I do want to talk about the impact of technology as well on migration. But before I get to that, let me just say that for listeners and viewers, if they want to learn more about Dr. Parag Khanna and about his books, and including his current one, Move, they can go to paragkhanna.com. That's his website, paragkhanna.com. That's PARAGKHANNA.com. Parag, let's come to the issue of technology. So, this is sort of a most obvious statement, a tautology, if you will. Technology is changing the world, right? We all know that. But let's peel back the onion a little bit. In terms of human geography, how is technology changing the world? I'm not just talking about things like, the Hyperloop or super fast trains and that kind of thing. I'm also talking about artificial intelligence, virtual reality, the Internet of Things. What is the impact of that dimension on human mobility moving forward?
Oh, it's a great question. So, technology cuts multiple ways in terms of migration. We've viewed it, let me give you a few examples or categories. The first is automation, right? So in the last 10, 20 years, as factory work has been automated, you've seen people forced to move away from the towns and the cities that they've lived in. Think about the Rust Belt in Detroit or coastal China. As people lose their jobs because of automation, they can't afford to live where they are anymore. They move to lower cost areas. They look for new jobs. They try and figure out where the economy is growing, where jobs are being created, and they go there. Then there's the other dimension. You could call it the more positive one, which is remote work, digitization, universal internet access, people working in the skilled services economy, IT and other areas. They can now live wherever they want. So you have young people saying, bye-bye San Francisco, hello Bali, right? Bali, Phuket, Panama, you name it, Costa Rica, Mexico, whatever. So, that's the flip side of technology. Then, of course, people who don't get to physically move at all can at least be digitally connected and can earn a really good, life, have a higher quality of life than they would otherwise have. But let's remember that just doing remote work doesn't spare you from the political or environmental challenges of the countries that many people live in. So it's not good enough. I still believe that human resettlement, migration, is a very powerful force, and one that we're going to have to rely upon more and more so that people can live in places where they can genuinely be the most productive.
Right. No, that's a great point. I mean, this is something that is roiling the world in so many different ways, and roiling has a negative connotation to it. But obviously, technology has brought with it tremendous positive forces as well. So it's always a careful and difficult balancing act, and sort of different people are at different ends of the spectrum in terms of some of the benefits, real or perceived.
Let's look at also what's happened during the pandemic. Wall Street banks, consulting firms massively increased their footprint in India because they realized that, and there's a great quote about this: if you can do your job anywhere, then someone anywhere can do your job. And that someone anywhere is actually a young Indian in India. And that's why the investment banks and consulting firms started, increasing their floor space that they've rented, the co-working spaces, the offices, so that they could hire more and more Indians. And this obviously couldn't have come at a better time, because even the digital labor automation has been taking a bite into the Indian IT sector. So the fact that, because of digital connectivity, because of skills, that's a big vote of confidence in the young Indian tech worker. And that's a good thing.
There's so much just in this little podcast, Parag, to think about, talk about, discuss, but there's a lot more in your book, Move, and I really hope that people pick it up once it's released in their respective countries and really get the chance to sort of dig deep into it. I know that readers will find a lot there that really is very, very thought-provoking, with a lot of data and statistics to back it up as well, but also an easy narrative flow that is quite characteristic of Parag's work. Before we end, Parag, one last question. In your prologue, you've talked about where will you live in 2050? That's the question you've asked. So tell me, where will you and Aisha be hiring your real estate agent? What city?
Well, I think we might keep them busy, because I think we'll be on the move. I think we're going to live in multiple places and shuttle around and probably chase our children or whatever the case may be. But in terms of places where I feel really at home that are also climate resilient, the place that stands out is Berlin, because Berlin's a place I've lived multiple times over the last 30 years. It's in a very good geography. It's safe from rising sea levels. It's a thriving multicultural hub. It's a great, former and future global city. It's a place I know like the back of my hand. So I have a feeling I'll probably be in Berlin.
I think people are beginning to wake up to the fact as well, Parag, slowly, that Berlin is becoming a bit of a entrepreneurial hub within sort of mainland Europe as well. And that's another interesting facet, right, about Berlin. And German politics, as you know better than I do, is still coalescing broadly around the center left or center right. I mean, there are, far right, far left political parties in Germany as well, but the German penchant for stability continues to manifest via its politics, even in its latest elections.
That's very well put, and it's fortunate that we can rely on that, but without taking it for granted. But the Germans do have this penchant for stability, and the extremes have fallen away time and time again in the elections. They have realized that they are an immigrant society, a mass migration society they're becoming more diverse. They're struggling to embrace it, but they're doing a much better job, more progressively than many other countries. And perhaps this is a great note to end on, but there was a famous line in 1990 by a German politician where he said that Germany needs more Kinder statt Inder, which meant, we need to have more children and import less Indians. And as I say in this book, what they wound up with was a lot more Inder than Kinder. And that's a good thing, of course.
Right. Absolutely. So we'll probably see you at some point in the most fancy Indian restaurant in Berlin or Stuttgart or Hamburg or wherever it is.
It's my treat. Looking forward to seeing you there.
I'll take you up on that someday. Well, thank you, Dr. Khanna, for being with us on this podcast or videocast, however you're consuming your information. And again, the website for Parag's book is paragkhanna.com. I'll spell that out, Paragkhanna.com. KHANNA.com. It's a book that I highly recommend. I hope that you pick it up. And as Indians around the world, or in India might say to end this conversation, namaste.
Thank you, Sanjeev.
Great. Thanks, Parag.